Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland, and behind me is the house where Lord Leverhulme lived for most of his middle age and elderly years. So I'm in Hampstead, London, just across the road from Hampstead Heath. So William Lever was born in Bolton, Lancashire in 1851. His father was a well-to-do grocer. He didn't just have one grocer's shop, he had a whole chain of them. William Lever was, I think, the eldest son of quite a few children. The family were Congregationalists, and his family story was one of sort of Victorian self-improvement and moralism. So they engaged in regular Bible study, they were completely abstemious, they didn't smoke, and they were a bit too sort of self-righteous and sanctimonious. Anyhow, and his mother, she surprisingly had an independent career before she wed as a manageress of a mill, which was, for the mid-19th century, was like way ahead of its time. So William was only middling in terms of his academic achievement, but he had thought about entering a profession such as architecture. His mother wondered whether he might become a doctor, but his father was not having his son become a physician or anything like that. So at the age of 15, he had to leave school, and he actually had more schooling than most people had in those days. Remember, until 1870, some people didn't go to school at all. So he had to join the family business, and his father said he would not be in the least bit nepotistic, and his son would have to do all the menial duties like any newbie in the company. So he was doing all these lowly jobs, and his remuneration was something of the order of £1 a week. And he's going to have to work his way up. All right, he's probably going to inherit it in the end, but he had to know what it's like to be an ordinary grunt at the lowest level, and then he could sympathize with them, and he could look them in the face, and he'd be a more effective manager rather than just saying, oh well, you can do virtually no work and still have a high position, even if you're guilty of dissipation and idleness and all the rest of it, and you're totally incompetent. Anyway, so he moved into his father's business, which was mainly about comestibles, but Leverhulme thought that soap was where it was at, and that's what William Lever is noted for, is really inventing sunlight soap. And so he branched off into that, and he became very, very wealthy through that, and eventually built Port Sunlight, which is just by Liverpool. So palm oil was an essential ingredient for this, imported mostly from Africa, from countries such as Nigeria. And the late 19th century, we were getting the idea that cleanliness was next to godliness. People were beginning to understand that things like washing your hands is a lifesaver, because most people's personal hygiene was horrific. If you go back 2 centuries ago, we didn't have much chance to wash ourselves, wash our clothes very often. Some people couldn't afford soap, and so obviously that led to various diseases like typhoid and typhus and cholera and everything else. People stank, had very few sets of clothes, have to go and get water with a bucket from a well or a pump some distance away. But this was beginning to change. Anyway, so because people were so ruthlessly self-improving, and this was a part of respectability, this really did well for his business, and he advertised heavily. He understood the importance of promoting your product. You can have the best product in the world, but nobody can buy it if they don't know about it. Anyway, he became a very wealthy man and had houses in Liverpool, although he's from Lancashire, just north of there, and indeed here in London. And his brother James joined him in his business. So he married at the age of 23 after a 2-year courtship with a young lady who'd met through his church, predictably. They had several children, but only one of whom survived infancy, a son called William, if I remember rightly. So Leverhulme was later ennobled as Viscount Leverhulme right towards the end of his life. He was a Gladstonian liberal, and indeed he decided to enter the forum of public life. So he stood for Parliament in the liberal interest for the Wirral. The Wirral's a peninsula across the River Mersey from Liverpool, and indeed he was returned, so had a brief parliamentary career. Now, in those days, you could be a liberal and a passionate imperialist, and indeed he was. Thought this was bringing enlightenment to the benighted zones of the world. And so he's very eager for imperial expansion. This would also make it easier to obtain palm oil. Anyway, he then made a contract with the Belgian authorities in the Congo. This is after it being confiscated from Leopold II, King of the Belgians. All the abuses under King Leopold have been brought to light by Sir Roger Casement and an African-American missionary whose name escapes me. But anyway, unfortunately, under the administration of the Belgian government, not the king personally, things hadn't improved that much, and people were still forced to work. Some of these people were toiling for starvation wages and so on. So he was complicit in some of these abuses, and there were some conscience-stricken Belgian administrators, clergymen and so on, who were horrified by the conditions that these luckless Congolese were working under, and protested about it. So that came out, and that really damaged his reputation. He'd been involved in another libel suit where he'd retained the redoubtable Edward Henry Carson as his King's counsel to defend his reputation. And across the courtroom, on the other side was Rufus Isaacs, the future Marquis of Reading, as in the Viceroy of India. So he's a very wealthy man to retain some of the best paid barristers in the realm. So by the time the First World War came, he was out of Parliament, and he was out of the House of Commons, and he was frail, so he didn't play any role in public life at that stage. But he was glad his son survived the First World War. So he died in 1925, if I remember correctly. So Port Sunlight, which he built, was meant to be a model village. So he was that sort of philanthropic Victorian businessman along the lines of Robert Owen, as in a happy worker is a hard worker. That was his philosophy. Treat them well, decent wages, reasonable working hours, health and safety at work, and they will be loyal to you, and you're providing an example of Christian morality, and you'll recruit the best people, and you'll keep the best people, rather than someone who's just going to work them to the bone and treat them as wage slaves, in which case you'll only get those who are absolutely desperate. Anyone who can leave shall leave, and all the rest of it. And he didn't want them to drink, but he was quite democratic. He said, if over 75% of you vote for an alcohol license for this local hostelry, then it should be allowed, and 80% of them voted for it, which he hadn't anticipated. But true to his word, he honoured the result of that and allowed them to have alcohol in Port Sunlight, which he completely owned. He gave them good long-term lets on the cottages there. So that is Lord Leverhulme, a great rival of Pears Soap. Pears Soap, you may know from those adverts, they bought this John Everett Millais painting Bubbles, and they used that very heavily in their advertising campaign to give this image of homeliness and familial bliss to their product. Anyway, Port Sunlight, according to Sunlight Soap, was really a public relations masterstroke because of all the positive connotations of sunlight, who would not want to be associated with that. So that is a little bit about him, about Leverhulme, and his company then became part of the British-Dutch conglomerate Unilever, so it still exists. He was a generous donor to various charitable causes. The Lever Trust is going to this day. That's a little bit about Lord Leverhulme. Toodaloo.